it before, and he is here now to try and do it again. It is still possible that regardless of match result, both of these players make it through to the playoffs. We do not know yet, but what we do know is that Nodirbek has what it takes, and surely even the tiniest fraction of Magnus Carlsen's mind must agree with that, must acknowledge that at the very least.
Definitely. There's always hope, even when you play a giant of the game. And Nodirbek has done it before. This game does begin with a Queen's Pawn opening. Magnus Carlsen goes for, okay, it's branch of the Queen's Gambit declined. A transposition here. Magnus, will he bring out his bishop? No, he trades pawns. And a very classical start to this game. In strategic waters, he should be a heavy favorite against Nodirbek. If it becomes more dynamic, anyone's game.
A traditional line, millions of games have been played in this opening setup. As the bishop comes out, eventually for Magnus it will be about opening up diagonals for his light squared bishop. Meanwhile for Nodirbek, he will try to reroute the knight from the left flank towards the right side of the board. He first takes out his own bishop. With this particular approach by Nodirbek does invite some potential complications. The g-pawn pushing forward could be ambitious play. We're about to find out Magnus's mindset.
Yeah, and Magnus is known as the leading expert in this pawn structure, mainly from the black side, but interesting to see him kind of flip the board here, take it from the white side, happy to just set up this very solid structure. Here we see a trade of bishops. It's a pawn sacrifice from Magnus Carlsen, but do not take that pawn. The black queen taking on b2 would only be met by the white rook sliding across, and white would regain the pawn with the rook on b7 with a lot of interest.
And Nodirbek does realize that. He keeps things under control, brings his own knight into the game. Magnus still ignoring the b2 pawn hanging. Now he finally does draw back with the queen, defends it. Nodirbek advances with a flank side attack, trying to gain more space on the queen side.
So let's talk some of the ideas in this position, in this kind of pawn structure. We mentioned already the possibility of the g-pawn marching up the board. Now that we've castled kingside, does that make that significantly less likely, or is that actually still a feature? Are we playing things like king h2 and then proceeding with the plan? What's going on here?
Yeah, I think it makes it less likely, at least in the near future, pushing pawns in front of your own king while queens exist. A bit risky, but more likely here, Magnus Carlsen first relocating his knights. He wants to play on the queen side, that flank the queens sit on. You can go for what they call a minority attack. White has two pawns, the A and B. Black has a lot more pawns there. You can try and trade off, isolate some of your enemy pawns, and create some targets for your pieces a bit later. For now, though, it just looks like pure maneuvering. Both sides setting up their rooks, getting ready. The white queen dropping back, very mysterious. But I think we'll see the status quo maintained for the next 15, 20 moves, and then the fire be unleashed.
And what about if you're playing with the black pieces here, Tanya? Are there any particular, I don't know, outposts or pawn advances that could be committal or anything of the sort that you're particularly watching out for?
Well, this is the minority attack that David was earlier implying about, right? Magnus using his two pawns on that queen's flank to get those open lines in. You mentioned outpost. If you're allowed to breathe fire down, Magnus will use that knight and jump to the c5 square. Yep. Any trades would open up some lines in favor of Magnus. We see some pawn trades here. The rook was attacking the queen moves, and look at that, Magnus doubling down on that c5 square. He pushes the pawn. That b4 pawn contains the pawn chain that Nodirbek has on the queen side.
Okay, so a reasonable amount of pressure being applied early on. Not exactly like this isn't going to be, you know, backbreaking or anything like that, but we're asking questions and we're trying to give our opponent the opportunity to make mistakes. Those mistakes aren't happening. We just want to start introducing the potential cracks in the armor, looking for first, maybe second weaknesses. Let's see what's going on the other side of the board and poking and prodding to see where the position could be weaker.
Exactly. It's just accumulating small advantages. First, you want to isolate one of your opponent's pawns. Then you want to maybe trade off the correct set of pieces. Only then do you start looking for a plan of action. First, we see a rook trade, Nodirbek pausing. Slightly surprising that he decides not to instantly recapture or even pre-move a recapture, maybe thinking about trading knights first. But there we go, knights do drop off the board on Magnus's terms, and the knight leaps forward.
And now we could potentially see an imbalance appear in the position. You know, if you take that knight, which has just moved forward, that would mean the B pawn. You always want a flank pawn towards the center. That's how you want to capture, opening up a B line, a direct path to Nodirbek's B7 weakness there.
And I'm going to guess that the pawn on b4 is absolutely nowhere close for the taking because of rook b... Well, a whole bunch of moves starting with rook b1, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, for now, the black knight is hit as well, so there's not quite time for the black queen to go pawn hunting. I would advocate for not taking that white knight. I've banged on about this too much in my chess career, but connect 4 is the perfect pawn structure. White's b-pawn taking and replacing that white knight on c5 would set up an unbreakable wall that black will never break through. So keeping the knights on the board, at least trying to improve the black knight here, a good decision. He's going for that white b-pawn on the b4 square.
And this is getting extremely concrete now because Magnus better have something up his sleeves. He does capture the central pawn. He's given Nodirbek a b-passer, which can start moving up the board. Magnus is relying on his central pawns eventually moving forward. Perhaps some attacking ideas as well. The white queen going to the g4 square, lining up against the king, with some checkmating patterns developing with the knight maneuvering eventually. This is becoming tricky for both players. He goes back instead with the knight to c5.
It certainly looks like we're setting up to say, you know what, let's play an endgame. White's got 1 pawn island, black's got 2. Who is going to be more comfortable potentially pushing for a win in that sort of scenario? Is there any way to isolate a black pawn and play against that in the end? This is all getting rather technical.
Yeah, getting rather technical, and one of our fans there in the audience working with his technology on the phone there. But in the meantime, I think it's all about which pieces to trade. If queens come off the board, it's unclear who benefits. It's probably the side who can attack the enemy pawns with their rooks. If knights disappear, I think that really helps black. The white knight's so active right now. Bishop for knight trade is available for Nodirbek. He can remove that knight from the board. But then the black king loses its best defender if the f8 bishop disappears. It's just a series of very small questions. Ultimately, alone, one trade might not change the balance too much, but if you leave your opponent with the superior pieces in the endgame, that could be decisive.
And you want to be able to get activity for white by playing moves like queen out to g4, but then you allow the black queen to move in and get really active and start harassing the rook as well. So it feels really unclear, and it's almost one of those games where whatever you do, keep everything active. You can't afford a passive move.
Exactly. And a trade there. It's queen and knight versus queen and bishop, a big imbalance now, and activity is the name of the game. The queen and knight hold their own because they control a lot of central squares.
And honestly, both combos look very tempting. You know, the black queen and knight on those light squares, really nicely planted. The black knight has a beautiful outpost, cannot be kicked out. Magnus's bishop doing a fantastic job on the longest diagonal on the board as well. Extremely active, plus defending its own pawns. That is the big imbalance here, and it's coming to the point of just asking these small questions. That's just what Magnus Carlsen does best. You know, keeps probing his opponent just little by little. It almost feels inconsequential. It's somehow gaining that little time on the clock, gaining that little advantage, those strategic points. There's a b7 weakness. Watch out for that. But right now, we've got Nodirbek, who lines up his own rook against the white queen. For Magnus, the big question would be, does he want queens on the board or off the board?
That's I love the way you summed that up about Magnus, Tanya. With a lot of players and a lot of games, it's, oh, look, there's a big mistake. Here's a positional weakness that's been introduced that we can target in 4 or 5 moves' time. Magnus plays these subtle, maneuvering, grinding moves where you don't understand why that's useful until 12, 15, 20 moves later, and then it all sort of clicks into place. It becomes clear. He's a master at being able to do that to anyone on the planet.
And you have to take 20 right decisions, these small questions being asked. And that's the tough part about facing Magnus. David, we often talk about the Magnus touch in the endgame. He does decide to trade the queens off the board. Are we going to see a vintage Magnus grind here?
Well, the ingredients are there, but Magnus did a bit of a double take. He missed this last move, potentially. The black knight blocking the power of the white rook. The bishop in the center of the board is next on the menu. If you move the white bishop away, the black rook gets in. So it does feel like, objectively, Nodirbek totally fine, but we have seen Magnus squeezing water out of that stone so many times before, gaining space, pushing pawns, ready for any potential pawn race later. I'm going to say a draw much more likely than a Magnus grind here specifically, just because Nodirbek has enough time on the clock, but you never know. We've seen it before.
We've said it possibly hundreds of times. I'm sure some people have said it thousands of times, where the eval bar, dead draw, dead draw, dead draw, squeezing just a tiny bit, and then a little bit more, and it's like a snowball that becomes an avalanche, and Magnus just finds a way to conjure those out of nowhere.
It's just unbelievable, right? It's a draw until it's not, and you don't even know where it all slipped away. But so far, Nodirbek's doing a great job of keeping everything under control. That knight is a beautiful attacker, also a defender, just completely restricts Magnus's rooks, also takes away some key squares from the bishop. Meanwhile, he's using his rook for activity. The clocks, yes, Magnus has got an advantage, but 4.5 minutes still feels like should be enough for Nodirbek. But look at that, Magnus, he's pushing the pawns in the center, you know, once again, asking questions. Are you scared? I'm going to push that just a little bit more.
Exactly. Poking and prodding, going, okay, not much going on here. I accept there's not much going on. Let's make something go on. And that's just Magnus's attitude to every position. And he does that when he's in worse positions as well. And you think, hang on a second, this is about to flip. I thought I was the one who's supposed to be pressing, yet he's pressing me. When we've seen him do that to so many people before. So yeah, very, very dangerous player and #1 in the world for good reason.
In the meantime, Magnus asks another difficult question. Do you want to trade rooks or not? Black would be justified in going back. There we go. He does retreat. Magnus looks surprised on the camera there. But a rook trade, I think, would have been totally fine as well for Nodirbek. Black has a fortress. Very difficult to break through past the black knight. But Nodirbek wants the tension, and here we go. Pawns on light squares, bishop controls dark squares. That is classic Magnus Carlsen strategy. And it feels like Nodirbek is just waiting here. He's playing the waiting game, Tanya.
Doesn't have much of a choice, right? The knight is ideally placed, the rook maximized for black as well, also in the open line, the king centralized. For Magnus, the big question is, can he strike in the center with that e-pawn moving forward? Who will those trades benefit? That's the key in this position, right? That Magnus holds the break. He's the one who'll decide when to open up the position, and he decides it's right now.
Okay, that doesn't come without risk. Magnus Carlsen, he's going for it. The black pawns were hit there on the king side, but now the black rook has access into the white position. There we go. It attacks the white isolated pawn on c5, and Magnus goes in with his rook. This is already narrowing the margin for error. The black rook here can grab a pawn, but then the white rook gets into the 7th rank. Rook and bishop combine so well, and it's already a blunder by Nodirbek.
And this is what happens every single time. All those little questions. Finally, this moment, and Magnus Carlsen out of nowhere is winning. The rook about to land on the 7th rank. The pawn beautifully placed. The bishop centralized. There's a check, and you can see panic on Nodirbek.
He gives a check, but en passant here, taking that pawn as if it just moved 1 square. They say it's a streamer's favorite move, but that is also the most effective move. There we go. Magnus has tripled pawns on the g-file, but if you take that pawn back for Nodirbek, your king is caught in a mating net. The white rook will slide down to the 7th rank, end up on g7. Magnus looks happy. He's winning.
He's got all the reasons, and now suddenly Nodirbek's knight completely offside, far away from defending the king. I mean, that would just lead to checkmate. A pattern we saw Hikaru deliver with his own rook and knight against Sindarov. And we ask ourselves, how did this even happen?
You see the furrowed brow there on the face of Abdusattorov. He's going, hang on a second, what on earth happened here? Like you said, Tanya, it's a draw until it isn't. And Magnus looking pretty chilled out with proceedings, but wow, what a way to squeeze an unbelievable win out of this game. Well, let me rephrase that. Unbelievable if it was any other player. For Magnus, it's called Tuesday.
Yeah, most of us would have just repeated the position, done nothing, acquiesced to the draw. Instead, the black rook there had to give itself up for the white bishop because Magnus, out of nowhere, magically created that mating net. The white rook was about to land on g7. Now it's a clean-up job. The black knight has a couple of squares to jump to, a couple of checks, but ultimately will not be able to stem the tide. The white rook is going to be so effective here at cleaning up the black pawns, which are separated and isolated.
Nodirbek also completely in disbelief. He just keeps shaking his head. A position totally in control for the black pieces, for Nodirbek. Played a beautiful game, really. You know, kept everything intact. The knight, rook, playing brilliantly, and then suddenly out of nowhere, is getting checkmated, has to give up his rook. He can give a few more checks, but that's really not going to help. Magnus can decide to centralize his king. That look from Nodirbek is one of a player giving up. He realizes there's barely anything to fight for. You pick up that pawn that's on the left side, put it closer to the H pawn, yes, you can play on. But right now, with the pawns just being so far apart, one of them about to fall, I think Nodirbek's about to fall.
You can tell from the body language here. Although surprisingly, stone cold, 88 BPM on heart rate. It's lower than Magnus's at the moment. Unbelievably fit. But unfortunately, you can't say the same for the position. So right now, things looking like they are collapsing for Nodirbek, almost reliant on an extremely rare and uncharacteristic blunder from Magnus. I think this is going to be 1-0 very, very shortly.
Yeah, landing some knight forks there was Nodirbek's goal. Be careful, the black knight jumping back with a check, so he keeps his rook and king on opposite color complexes. That's how to avoid knight forks. If you keep one piece on a light square, one piece on a dark square, they can't get hit simultaneously, and the black knight now has to give way. The black c-pawn dropping, and Nodirbek resigns.
Wow, absolutely fantastic stuff from Magnus. Was it a vintage Magnus grind? Perhaps not. At least it wasn't 120 moves, let's put it that way. But the exact same strategy was there. Maneuver your pieces, look for small openings, give your opponent chances to make small mistakes so that something that looks really innocent turns out to be a blunder by design.
Always, right? Magnus Carlsen goes fishing in a dried up pond and comes back with the catch of the day, as he did in this one. Just looked like that had to end in a draw. And these were the final moments, you know, Nodirbek trying to get tricky with those knight jumps, but Magnus finding the perfect spot for the king, getting rid of that defender, finally picking up the c6 pawn, and this was the moment that Nodirbek that resigned. It was the last few moves. You could see him shaking his head.
Yep.
He couldn't believe how this slipped out of his hands.
Why is it, an impossible question to answer, David, to be clear. Why is it that Magnus can do this to anyone on command, but other people can't? What is that secret sauce? What does he have for breakfast?
It's experience, it's that muscle memory, it's the know-how, the cunningness to always be alert, setting traps, and just forcing the opponent to walk these narrow pathways, changing the pace when necessary. They do say, take kids to the endgame. Magnus loves taking the younger opponents into these drier territories and kind of wearing them down. Nodirbek cannot trade queens in the next game. He has to go on the attack, go for Magnus's king. A position like that, you never beat Magnus, and more often than not, he takes you down.
Now that is interesting though, because Nodirbek, look, he does come from a background where at a very young age he has scored wins against Magnus Carlsen. He is coming back in game number 2 with the white pieces looking to go on the attack. This is territory where he has scored the dubs before.
Yes, he has. But again, you know, after those wins that he got, reminding everyone of 2021 World Rapid Championship as well as 2023, every match has felt like a payback for
Well, it's 2025 now, so he always skips a year, so maybe this is the time.
Well, if he has to get it done, it has to be this game, right? Good news for Nodirbek, he starts with the white pieces, so he might be able to control the narrative of the amount of complications he could get on, or we get the king's pawn opening. And will Nodirbek try to play something aggressive with a central pawn break, or will we see a more cautious approach with the Spanish?
Yeah, instead it's the Scotch opening, the Scotch game. We see a trade of knights here. Nodirbek advances with his pawn in the center. This is known to be very, very ambitious with white. You've ruined the black pawn structure. Neither side can castle easily. The queens are both a bit clumsy, and therefore it leads to more imbalance. And a very interesting choice by Nodirbek. I think a good practical decision. Depends how well prepared Magnus Carlsen is, of course, but unlikely that Magnus has looked at this unfashionable opening in recent times.
And this is interesting as well, purely in the history of the Esports World Cup and what's gone on so far today. On the surface, we're going, ooh, difficult to calculate, unclear positions. Magnus has got to be favored against anyone in the field. But we've had surprise after surprise sprung at us today in this very arena. So Abdusattorov here trying to manufacture one of his own.
Well, no surprises so far in this match with Magnus sort of grinding that end game. So it really comes down to this. Can Nodirbek, you know, get that shocker in? Can he get the big upset in? Can he get his win to force an Armageddon? Not going to be easy, but I think it's a bit of an opening success. He forced Magnus to take a think, you know, which means that Magnus is perhaps not as comfortable in the Scotch opening as he would have been in the other setups. Magnus, meanwhile, sets up a development concept for his bishop, which we call the fianchetto, to try to get to that central e5 pawn.
And I'd like to think that I have a little hand in this. This was my pet opening with white in Blitz for the last 10 years.
Oh.
I've played hundreds and hundreds of Blitz games in this exact variation with the Scotch, the white knight coming out early, but unlikely Nodirbek was looking at...
Next 10 moves, David. Go.
Next 10 moves.
Let's go.
Both sides are going to bring their bishops out. Both sides are going to get castled. White's going to defend the e5 pawn with a rook, maybe with a knight, and it's going to be a very imbalanced middle game. One that I don't think is better for white, but at least gives some chances.
Wait, hang on. So this is your best pet, this is your pet opening
Yes.
for the last 10 years, and then you end this with, by the way, I don't actually think it's better for white.
No, it's just tricky. And that's my
Just
Blitz
checking.
style.
You swindler.
Okay, the black knight doesn't move. It was hit. There's a pin. The black bishop on a6 pins down the white c4 pawn, and both sides do get castled. I'm expecting Magnus to do the same here, but the eval bar getting a bit more optimistic for white. I have found from my experience in this opening that the black bishop on a6 is very misplaced in a lot of variations, kind of bites on granite. So some hope for Nodirbek.
Oh, okay. So are we thinking like if white can, I don't know, cement a pawn on b3, get a rook to the d or e file, and just move the queen out of the way, you're asking black the question, thanks for developing your bishop to a6. What are you doing there? And there's just no good place for it to go. Is that the idea?
That's the hope.
Okay.
No guarantees, especially against Magnus, but that is the hope. The black knight in the center is kind of caught in two minds as well. It's not directly attacked because of the pin from the black bishop on a6, but at some point it will have to give way.
And that point will be when Nodirbek decides to move the queen away and unpin itself. Right now,
Sure.
he does improve the position of the knight, trying to not only defend that e5 pawn, but sort of eye those greener pastures. There's a nice central square for the knight to eventually jump on. Magnus decides enough is enough, moves his knight away, attacks the pawn. John, your idea of b3, consolidating the pawn in c4, but Magnus tripling down on it.
This is fun because, as we all know from streamer chess, en passant is forced. Unfortunately, if that gets played here, the dark squared bishop from black is eyeing up a free rook on a1. So gonna have to break the rules on this occasion. And suddenly, that bishop on a6 is frankly applying a heck of a lot of pressure to the c file.
It is for now. En passant would also drop the white queen. There's a pin on the e-file and on the long diagonal. So multiple pins that Magnus Carlsen is using to try and win this match. But for now, there are still resources here. And even dropping the c4 pawn, even allowing that black bishop on a6 back into the game, isn't the end of the world. White otherwise has a very healthy pawn structure.
And I think what those tactics would be relying on is you give up the c4 pawn with the hopes and dreams of activating your own light squared bishop on g2. You're eyeing those c-pawn weaknesses that Magnus has created if there's a trade on the c4 square. So a lot of tactics, it sort of seems like the position that's about to explode. I don't see a healthy way for Nodirbek to defend the pawn, and I think he's setting up those ideas. Saying, Magnus Carlsen, take my pawn, I'm going to play for compensation. If you were to grab on c4, Magnus does not rush.
Magnus has studied these types of things before. I've seen him play these types of positions in Blitz. I'm very surprised, therefore, that Nodirbek, having chosen this opening, is the one lower on the clock. He's a minute and a half down. After all, if you choose the opening, you want to be well versed in it and at least land the surprise, land the time advantage. But for now, world number one Magnus Carlsen looking very comfortable.
Are there any kind of positions that Magnus Carlsen hasn't studied before, David Howell?
That's true. Freestyle chess positions, but he loves those too.
Yeah, I hear he's quite good at that as well, unfortunately. So it feels like he's a bit of a Swiss Army knife. What you could say one of the best. Isn't that interesting? But in this kind of position, I love the fact that even though the c4 pawn can be won, Magnus is taking his time about it, right? It's not exactly like a wonderful full pawn up that you can easily convert in an endgame because there are still doubled pawns on the c-file. It's not the biggest advantage in the world. He can sort of take his time here. Isn't that interesting?
He doesn't need to rush with that decision because there's really no good way for white to actually defend that pawn at any given moment. You never want to retreat your knight to hang that pawn because you lose another central one instead. So he's just saying the moment you unpin your queen is when I'll grab that pawn. But I'm not going to rush with that decision. I'll just keep the tension on till then. You waste a move, that's when I'll win that pawn. And then we see a few more moves here coming in with tempo, attacks the queen. Magnus pushes that bishop back. Nodirbek bringing it to f4, keeping the center under control. Some trades. Eventually, I'm expecting Magnus to go up a pawn because of that c4 weakness.
I'm very surprised that Nodirbek kind of invited this. He lost a tempo with his bishop. The white dark square bishop moved out, hit the black queen, then retreated. This is the plan that Magnus wanted to set up anyway. He wanted to break out and erode white's stronghold in the center. Now that pawn for white on e5 has disappeared. Yes, you can take back on e5 with your bishop, but it's only going to result in trades. You kind of pin yourself as well on the e-file. This feels like it's gone wrong for Nodirbek in the last two moves. 3 minutes down as well on the clock.
Very tricky. And the reason you can't capture that pawn with your own knight is because then Magnus Carlsen has set up the g5 idea, deflecting the defender. All the pins on the e-line will land into trouble. So instead, capturing with the bishop. And now Magnus has plenty of choices. You could trade. You could get more attack, you pin it, you win it, find a way to get to that bishop, grab on c4, a lot of tempting options, and Magnus chooses one that's perhaps the strongest, wins material.
We see a quick queen trade, but in the process, Magnus has won a rook for bishop. Yes, it's only the exchange, as we call it in chess, but the black rook looks mighty strong as well. Question mark given to Nodirbek's last move. It feels like if Magnus is solid enough, if he makes sure there's no counterplay, the bishops don't break out, then he should still be in control. Nodirbek, it feels like a roll of the dice.
It's not all about grinding out those small imbalances to try and find a win in the endgame. Magnus showing that he can out-position and out-tactic opponents in the middle game as well, showing some of the versatility that has made him the #1 player that he is today. So frustrating position for Nodirbek to be in. And I also want to point out, yes, okay, players go exchanges down all the time, but this quickly against a player like Nodirbek, it's just incredible the kind of things that Magnus can pull out of his hat.
Yeah, looked like a level opening position.
Right.
And 5 moves later, he's a rook for bishop up in a game he only needs to draw with black. Magnus, though, kind of accepting that it's not over yet. Just to point out, white does have a big threat on the board. The white knight wants to enter the center, land on d4, attacking the black rook, and winning a pawn on c6 in the process. So Magnus needs to preemptively deal with that one.
And he also kind of understands, right, the moments where he needs to pause. He understands these threats that his opponent's setting up and just sort of doesn't give them the chance. Like you said, the one big idea, and look at that. Magnus just coolly and calmly not only defends the a5 pawn, also takes control of the c6 pawn. Now he can just fall back with the rook, gain complete control. He's up on material. I mean, he's playing like liquid here. Impossible to contain, smooth endgame conversion. Brilliant stuff by Magnus.
Could become solid if need be, this liquid player. And he's just covered all the holes, rock solid. Again, it's a change of gears. He accelerates it, wins the material, then he takes a step back. He knows he's done the hard work, and just defending everything is enough for now. Nodirbek needs something special, but if there's nothing immediate here, black will have time to make use of that rook.
Feels really strange as well, being in a position where the light squared bishops are staring each other down through several pawns in the center of the board, where actually, like, the position's kind of opening up, but the bishops are still just staring. Everywhere else, the action's been absolutely insane, but really, the minor pieces just feel like they're on lockdown a little bit.
It's amazing how Magnus has attacked and also defended. You know, that bishop on b7, it also doesn't only take control of c6, but makes sure that the d5 pawn is also supremely guarded, not allowing the bishop pair to get active. And now Magnus's knight comes into the game, tying down the white knight to defend the b3 pawn. It could next jump to the center of the board, knight e4 coming on, trying to trade off more pieces as the game goes towards a Magnus win.
Yeah, unfortunately for Nodirbek, he's coming up against the best front runner in chess history. When Magnus has a lead, you nearly never see him get pegged back. He knows how to just set up the barricades, be defensive, trade off the right pieces. You need to make sure Magnus is on edge, going for the win, because then you can counterattack. Here, counterattacking chance is minimal. The white rook indirectly eyeing up the black knight, but that black knight, as you mentioned, Tanya, can land in the center, can improve. The black pawns will start rolling. Minimal chance of a miracle here for Nodirbek.
It jumps further into the game, attacks the rook, and plants itself on a square where it's inviting a trade, but that trade will only help black to connect the pawns. Now the c-pawn's freed up, you know, it could go to c5, displace that white knight, which is a power piece at the center, c5 being set up. This is beautifully played by Magnus in this endgame.
We were talking earlier about how, okay, no big advantage here yet. The c-pawns were doubled. They didn't look great. It didn't look like it was a game-winning asset. And then you compare it to now, and you're thinking, hang on a second, Magnus has just been playing 20 moves ahead of everyone else, because this is suddenly looking beautiful. The d-pawn will be able to roll down the board with tempo as well. I mean, he just manufactures this out of thin air, I swear.
Yeah, and it just looks so smooth and effortless, almost. The black c-pawn hitting the white knight, c5, d4. Push those pawns. Nodirbek is going to get steamrolled. And the rook versus bishop kind of dynamic here just doesn't provide any counterplay long term. And okay, a trade, as you mentioned there, Tanya, though, the pawns will just begin to roll. He's hitting 2 pawns. He's hitting d5 as well. But trades here only going to guide black closer to that desired goal of a safe endgame.
And you've got to watch out, right? Magnus has all these ideas of that C pawn moving even further and then creating a B passer that's going to be unstoppable on the board. Magnus just grooving in his head. He's enjoying the position that he has. You know, he's got it all under control. Meanwhile, for Nodirbek, and these are the hard wins, right, where you can't figure out what went wrong. You don't even see a mistake that you've made. How do you overcome this mental block against a player like that? It's just psychologically just a very difficult place for a player to be, even the world number 7.
I'm afraid I'm in very much the stereotypical Hollywood movie guy going, it all happens so fast. I'm one of those guys who I don't have an answer to that question. It is unbelievable the extent to which Magnus can make it feel like I've done nothing wrong, and yet I'm not just getting beaten, I'm getting crushed.
We mentioned earlier, we've seen it all before. We've seen Magnus grind out these endgames hundreds, thousands of times, but feel for his opponents here. They've been on the receiving end of it. They've been victims to these endgame masterclasses so many times as well, and it's a matter of moments now before Magnus starts pushing those pawns forward. Full control. 5 minutes against 1 here. Nodirbek, he just never got in the game. It was just the previous endgame. It all turned there. He didn't hold, and he's being punished now. Magnus getting ready to start trading favorably. And, okay, playing safety first chess, dropping one of his central pawns, but still very much in control.
Another pawn could be picked up right now if you're white. Rook takes pawn, defending the knight. Magnus has set up his own bishop retreating. He wants to get as many pieces off the board as possible. There are back rank ideas if white goes pawn hunting. Bishop b7, it's on the board. The knight had to retreat defending. Rook d1 check. Wait, could you still go for this?
You could land a check with the black rook, even drop the exchange rook for knight, then white knight will take back on d1, but at the very end, the white bishop will be forced to self-pin and be lost.
That awkward move that didn't feel great earlier on, David, bishop on a6, saving the day now.
Exactly, and note how the white knight didn't take the black rook because the white knight is forced to defend its bishop. Cool tactic on the board by Magnus, and now he's going to go hunting for the white b3 pawn.
Just super stuff, right? Combining positional elements, strategic elements, and when the tactics present themselves, he just grabs it with both hands to finish it off in style. And now the b3 pawn, no one's coming to its defense. It will start marching up the board. You could just slide the rook away, clear the path, go b3. But look at this. Magnus doesn't want to give any chances to Nodirbek's knight there. Make sure that knight isn't getting close to the black king.
Yep, the knight jumping, hitting a rook. Magnus, though, just setting up his rooks in an ideal spot. He retreats, covering all pawns. And yeah, the problem is for Nodirbek, even if you play really well, you might secure a draw. Magnus is actually repeating the position. Will we see a draw? It is a draw, and Magnus Carlsen takes the match.
Absolute domination strategically in game number 2. It was a draw by repetition, but that is because Magnus Carlsen knew that a draw would be good enough to send him into the winner's match in his group. That was a masterclass in dismantling your opponent positionally in the middle game. What an incredible show of force from the world number 1.
And he did it from a position of strength, Magnus Carlsen. He still had several gears to go up if he so wanted. Nodirbek, we have to give him credit this second game for defending really, really well, but ultimately the damage was done in the first encounter, not able to hold a level endgame. How many times have we seen that before?
And I think that really plays on your mind. Getting over that first loss is what cost Nodirbek the match. Magnus just doing Magnus things, and he made it look easy. Team Liquid, Magnus Carlsen drowning out the competition as he usually does.
So that first game decisive, that second game, frankly, more dominant despite